He is also Matt served as the 2015 National Association of Residential Property Managers and the Portland chapter president, and had earned his residential manager professional designation. And then he also earned a certified apartment manager designation in 2015. So he's really got a lot of background in property management. But what I love about Matt is for the last 3 years, he has taken that knowledge, come and talk not only about what laws, the Oregon landlord-tenant laws, for lawyers' title, but also out into the public to our realtors, to our brokers, sharing that information, as well as statistical and demographical information. So I think you guys are in for a real great treat. He's very entertaining. Come up here, Matt. Matt Williams, please. Give him a round of applause.
Can everybody hear me all right? All right. Well, that made me seem really fancy. I don't know that I'm all that fancy. And I hope that the beer that you've been drinking today makes this a little more sexy. However, I don't know that it will, because you have cozy chairs, now you have a beer in you, you're going to start falling asleep. That's okay too, just don't snore. We're going to get into a little bit of my background is really taking a lot of pieces that are compartmentalized in the industry and putting those together for my clients. So, who here is a real estate broker? Raise your hand. Who here is licensed to do property management? Raise your hand. All of you should raise your hand. If you are a licensed real estate broker, you should be raising your hand because you're licensed to do that. And one of the things that I perceive to be a challenge in today's market is that that's really going to increase your liability as we get into some of this legislation. Because a lot of the legislation is going to require you to sell more properties with tenants in place. Oregon Landlord-Tenant Law, House Bill 2004, which we'll talk a little bit about later, essentially requires a homeowner to allow a tenant to remain in place and does not allow them to give a no-cause termination to a tenant in order to sell that asset. That means you have to sell the property using your realtor with a tenant in place while navigating all access, the lease agreement, and information associated with that. That's going to change the way that you guys do business. And so a lot of what I do over the last 15 years in real estate is I've taken that real estate piece, I've taken the property management experience that I've had, and I'm kind of merging those to come up with something that is a little bit more applicable to you as far as education and putting you in a position where you can minimize your liability as it pertains to you as a broker. So we'll talk a little bit about that. I will get into some statistics and updated market conditions and rental rates, and we'll talk about some of the things that are coming down the pipe. I tried to cram like 3 hours of information into about 50 minutes today, so I'll probably try to keep this flowing. I'm going to skip a couple of slides most likely. If you have any questions, specific questions afterwards, feel free to come up and chat with me, but I'm happy to answer questions for you as well. So we're at about 675 properties, primarily single family. I guesstimate about 550 or so of those are single family homes, so we are pretty specific with single family homes. We have a strong focus, not just in that, but one of our main focuses is to maximize the return, minimize the liability, and then look at each of these properties as not just an asset, but as a business, right? One of the challenges, I think, is that I'll have clients come to me at times and say, well, I want cash flow. Another one will say, well, I want appreciation. I want internal rate of return. What's a cap rate? So I have these questions as clients come to me, and really at the end of the day, what you want to be looking for is kind of a combination of all of those things, right? You're building a portfolio. And those are the conversations that I have with my clients. Those are the things that, the conversations that you're going to be having with your clients as you see kind of some of the shifting markets. So Josh talked a little bit about what the renter rates are, what the homeowner rates are. If you read the National Association of Realtors report, it tells you that about 50%, I think it's just over that, of the buyers in the market nationally are first-time home buyers. That's a crazy number. That's drawing people out of an unknown source into your market. If you're selling cigarettes and you are targeting only non-smokers and half of the people that are smoking are brand new, that's a significant shift in your marketing campaign. So in real estate, if you look at it from that perspective, we have a target market that currently you could identify as millennials. I understand that's not a term you're supposed to use unless you are one now, I guess. People are offended. But at any rate, those are millennials that you're drawing out of the woodwork. Now what I would assert right now to you is that we have an opportunity as brokers to look at what that shift looks like. What's it going to be in a couple of years? Where are they going to be living? What's the housing supply looking like? And how does that match up, statistically, with the number of boomers? You have boomers living in 3,000, 4,000 square foot houses. Do they need that? Not do you think they need that, but do they think they need that? Do they build an ADU and use that as a home when they want to be at home, to remain in the same neighborhood and then live someplace else and rent the front house out? Or are they selling those assets? Are they moving into 400 square foot apartments that the millennials are currently living in? Right? So there's going to be some shifts, and we're going to have to navigate those as brokers. So we're going to get into some of that. We essentially work collaboratively with realtors, CPAs, attorneys, insurance agents. And what I do is I go out and talk to client base of all of those different groups. Lawyer's Title has gotten me in front of a lot of real estate brokers, and that's really been great for me, and I appreciate it, because it not only helps me educate you, but it also puts me in a situation where, God willing, if you had a client that needed a property manager, hopefully you'll at least lean on some advice from me. If not, there are other professionals there, but the industry in general, from a property management perspective, has shifted, and it's gotten much more professional. And I don't know if you've noticed it all, but when I got into the real estate market initially, property managers were kind of the stepchild of real estate. And they were kind of put in the corner, and there were lots of ma and pa's, and ma would run the books, and pa would do the evictions and the heavy hand if they needed to get rid of them, and some of the maintenance, right? But that capped out because liability got really high, and expense got really high, and technology progressed, and we put ourselves in a situation here where the tenant expected more, the owner expected more, and there was too much liability for ma and pa not to be so stressed out about an industry that doesn't pay. So now you have professional companies. They're larger, they're more robust, they're more sophisticated, they're more compliant, they're training their staff and their team members, and I think that there's kind of cross-reference happening right now, and you may not be recognizing that. But with that liability and with the communication with tenants, given the fact that you are licensed to do property management, the consumer, the buyer or seller that you're representing, has, I think, a reasonable expectation that you would know how to advise them on whether or not the lease is in compliance, how to notice their tenants and if they can, and what the time frame would be for a closing with a tenant in place. And so those types of questions, as we kind of get into that, are going to become more of a challenge for you. And so I would assert that in lieu of getting pretty upset or irritated about the energy score process, which has a minimal impact, let's look financially for your buyer or seller. Let's look at the huge financial impact that this will have on your market as we see some of this legislation come down the pipe. Let's see, license in Oregon, Washington. We're members of lots of associations. I think are important, and then I've got some stuff up there too. Okay, so Portland is no longer the same investment environment. We all know that, right? It's a matter of what we're looking for, what our buyers are looking for, what our sellers are selling, and then what our target market might be. On the single-family side, we're going to get into some stats here in general, but there has been a significant shift, and it's been happening for the last 15 years. We've seen that happen. We've seen the market spike when they were giving loans out, if you could breathe, and then they saw a drop-off when all of those crashed, right? And we're going to look at some of those trends and how they followed some of the stats actually that Josh put up here as far as timing goes. And then now we have a recovery of 2016, 2017. What happens in a recovery? Housing prices go up, rental rates go up. So we have that kind of that natural trend that's economically driven. It's an ebb and flow market, and it's an ebb and flow investment strategy. And that's what your clients are looking for, right? Investors, management companies, they have to be more sophisticated and strategic. We talked a little bit more about that. It still makes sense to invest in real estate and in single-family homes, but you have to have a plan. You have to figure out ahead of time what you're going to be doing. We have quite a few accidental investors, and accidental investors to me are folks that were there in 2006 and bought that house, and unfortunately they were in the same position in 2009 when the housing prices were 20% below. They couldn't sell, they didn't have a job, they moved away for a job, they kept the house afloat, and they provided that to a tenant by choice, right? So now they're an investor, but they didn't mean it. Fast forward 5 years, they call me and say, hey, you know what? Market's great, it looks fantastic, I want to sell. I say, no problem. Let's take a look at the ledger, both appreciation, where you were when you purchased, where it dropped, what you were getting in rents, what you're getting in rents now. Oh wait, you're making money. You have equity in the home, you have appreciation in the home, and you also have cash flow. Now then they start to think, okay, this is more of a strategy. We're going to talk a little bit today about how we can look at that from a perspective of an owner who's trying to enter the market, who tries to come up with a plan ahead of time and looks at the cash flow. Because you're looking at combining appreciation and cash flow in order to make a return. And one of the things I think too is that we have this real cultural struggle right now as we transition. We're not the Portland of 15 years ago. We're not the country of 15 years ago. It's not the same political climate. There's a venomous relationship between alternate parties, whether it be landlord versus tenant, whether it be Republican versus Democrat, whether it be rich versus poor. There's this altercation immediately instead of collaboration. And I think that there are opportunities for us to modify that if we want to make that a part of our core culture. So current market conditions we're going to get into. A little bit of landlord-tenant law and ordinance. I think the reason that that's important is because I want you to really see the impact that it's going to have on you directly as a realtor. And then we're going to talk a little bit about the agent's impact, about the owner's impact, the tenant's impact, and then obviously if you're a buyer or seller, we'll kind of break that down. And then a practical response to that. How do we move beyond it? How do we get to the next one? Okay, so before we get too much, well, I'll go over this one first. Essentially, this is from the market action. You guys all have access to this. I don't know if you read these or look at the charts and kind of try to look at the trends. But if you look here, this is from October 2009, and the one on the left here are the average and median sales price. So you see the average and median sales price drop down, and this is obviously starting at a low point, so we're at the low point already. The spike has already happened, and then it's been climbing, right? And now we're at a median housing price of $380,000. You look at the right, we've got the family earnings median income can afford 110% of the house. Okay, so that's essentially saying you can afford 110% of the median house if you make the median income, which is about $72,000, right? So this is pretty much in line with one of Josh's slides. But if you look at it, where we are now is that line just below it, I think, is 100%. So that means you can afford 100% of the house. If you were an investor back in 2011, you can afford 180% of the house. You could buy 2 houses in 2011. And I was talking to a fellow realtor. They called me for some advice on something. They said, oh, I know that I'm supposed to know this, Matt, but I don't know it. And I said, don't, it was a random question. I said, don't worry about it. A lot of people assume because they're a realtor, they should know all these things. But the problem is, what happens with realtors and investments? As an investment strategy, you're a realtor. This is your business. You should know when to buy and when to sell, right? The general rule, you buy low, you sell high. But when the market's really great, you're making lots of money, you have money to spend on a house, so you buy high. And then when the market's not good, you're not making any money, you got to pay your bills, so you sell your house at a low. So that's what we as realtors do, in general. So the good part is that you know that now, and hopefully that perspective will put something in your mind, and you can think, oh, wait a minute, if there is a fallout later, I'll have an opportunity to buy. Let's stack up now. The next piece here I want you to realize is we need to understand the numbers. In general, you hear a lot in the media about what happens with investors from California, and they're buying up the market, and there's just no housing available. So I want to look at actual stats. So I had Lawyer's Title pull up some stats for me. There are 190,000, just over 190,000 single-family homes in the city of Portland. Those are single-family homes. 42,000, just over that, are rentals. That's about 22% of single-family homes in Portland are offered by choice, people taking the risk, providing housing to tenants. 34,000 are owned by Oregon residents. Those aren't California buyers. That's 81% of the single-family homes are owned by Oregon residents who pay taxes to Oregon, who live in Oregon, and contribute to the economy. I think that's really important. Those are your clients. A majority of single-family homeowners have between 1 and 3 houses, as from an investment perspective, if they're investing in single-family homes. And why do they do that? Because they don't trust Social Security being there when they're there. They don't trust some of the college funds that they're going to have to fund. They don't trust retirement funds, right? Their opportunity to retire comfortably is based exclusively on some investment strategy, and real estate is one of those avenues. So they go out and they buy single-family homes because they're familiar with it, with the maintenance of it, they feel good about contributing to the community, and they make a choice to do that. And I think that's really important because when you hear about all these California investors buying up the communities and just totally going crazy on the rental rates, it's not just them. This is a market-driven high and low, right? When the market is low, no one comes to help the landlords that have higher vacancy, that are giving away concessions, and have tenants that won't leave, right? I've got one fan out there, yes. So The other thing to really keep in mind, which was supported by Josh's numbers too, is that in 2016, when they pulled stats, you had 70% of renters that were between the ages of 24 and 35 and making $55,000 a year. That's great. Now, again, just as he mentioned, you fast forward, and they're not going to want to live in 400 or 500 square feet. So you've got these micro units that they're putting in, you've got some of the smaller apartments that they're putting in. I saw some national stats that show that some of the boomers are considering moving into major metropolitan cities and areas, and they're willing to rent apartments that are smaller. But I haven't really seen that as much in our local area, but it is something certainly to consider. So this also, in my opinion, if 70% of the renters are making $4,600 a month, to me that debunks the fact that all tenants are poor, right? Which is kind of the shift. So understanding the strategy, I just want you to look at the numbers from the core details. If the median income, or I'm sorry, the median house price is correct, and you're making the house is $380,000, you have a mortgage payment of $1,853, assuming that the rates are at 4.25%, and you put 20% down, and you only have 1% property tax rate, which probably isn't true. So that rent, I pulled up 5 $380,000 houses, and I ran rental comps on all of them. They averaged $1,800 to $2,200, so I plugged it in at $2,000. Assuming you only have $230 per month in expense, which is supposed to include your maintenance, professional services, vacancy, and additional expenses associated with that, you have an $83 a month loss. So if you're trying to enter the market as an investment strategy, buy a single-family house and buy a median house, you're not going to be able to have any cash flow with this. You're counting only on appreciation. That's a loss of $1,000 a year. Now, some of us will get tax benefits and be able to make up for that on the long haul, but others not. With this relocation we're going to talk about, with a 3-bedroom home, if you made $1,000 a year, it would take you 4.5 years to make up for the relocation penalty that the city of Portland is putting together. So the idea, in general, you purchase a home, you provide housing, you cover your expenses, and you make a profit. It's an investment strategy. Let's talk about some current rental conditions. So we're at about 4.37% overall in vacancy. That's up from 3.5%. Shows a little bit that your vacancy rates are coming up. Some of that is due to additional dwelling units coming on the market. Some of it, however, has to do with just kind of a softening market in general. These stats, by the way, a little caveat, don't take these and apply them to a single-family home. So a single-family home, $1.40 a square foot or $1.57 a square foot, that's not going to work, really, because you have houses in Park Rose that are 2,500 square feet. You've got one in Laurelhurst that's 2,500 square feet. That's not the same price per square foot. They're both in Northeast Portland, but you can't really do that. So these stats, on the single-family side, we don't really have a way to keep statistics on the rental side. Through NARCO, there are 45 property management companies who manage about 15,000 units in the Portland metro area, but they don't really have a reporting system the way that the multifamily folks do. So your price per square foot and your vacancy rates and things, these are based citywide. What you can do, however, is take some of these stats and apply them to different areas. If you're looking at an 8% increase in rents, you can say, okay, well, my single-family home can increase 8%, it'd be X, right? So you can apply some of these standards, but I wouldn't necessarily take these and say, oh, well, I've got a 2,500 square foot house, and I'm going to multiply that by $1.57. Yes, quickly.
Have you noticed a trend of landlords buying outside of the city of Portland to avoid $4,000 relocation?
Yes, so the question was, have I seen a trend of landlords buying outside of Portland? I think savvy landlords have noticed that Portland is kind of the instigator in a lot of that, and so they've started, over the years. I think there is a certain portion of scare piece there. I think in general, the bigger issue is the no-cause terminations. I think that's a larger concern. The relocation penalty does impact you directly, and I think that there are certainly some better ways. And I do think that in general, it will minimize reinvestment. Right, so the current landlords are going to remain because they're like, hey, it's cash flowing, and that's a one-time hit when I get ready to sell, or when I need that tenant out, and they're familiar. I think the bigger issue is new people entering the market to replace those landlords. So if you have 22% of the market, 22% of single-family homes in Portland that are being provided by landlords, let's say that they sell. The number of investors that are coming to be a replacement investor, I think, will shrink. So I think you'll see that 22% go down to 20%, go down to 16%, go down to 10% until people are saying, look, if it's multifamily, I'll go. If it's single family, it's not really worth it. which puts those families who can't afford a home but want the amenities of a home in a really tight spot and increases those rental rates. Sorry. So let's see. So with these stats, we're seeing 6.8% increase year over year on the rents. 4.7 of that is since last spring, with 40% of the housing remaining stable or decreasing in their rents. Just to give you some perspective, we've been increasing rents by about 8 to 10% over the per year over the last 4 years, and it's just this last year and a half that started to kind of slow down. And we were at, I think, 7.6% the 6 months prior, and then this past 6 months, it dropped to 6.8%. Average rents are $1.57 a square foot, up from $1.40. What I want to impart here is that the range, $2.30 in downtown core versus $1.27 in Troutdale Fairview. That's why people are commuting, right? They have an opportunity to pay 3/4 of the price out there. Now, your vacancy rate's far lower too, because you don't have any tall buildings. You have a higher vacancy rate in the downtown core because you've got an apartment right next door that's competing with that unit, whereas out in Fairview, Troutdale, not so much. Average operating costs have increased 15% in Multnomah County, and taxes have increased 7 to 12%. So you've got kind of a force of tenant advocates and city commissioners and whatnot saying, hey, we need to cap these rents. Meanwhile, you have the operating costs and expenses associated with that continuing to go up. I think that causes a problem. Then you go back to that analogy earlier with a $380,000 home. You're already struggling to cash flow if you're trying to enter the market. If you already own it, you probably have a significant portion of equity. Or if you want to enter the market and have a cash flow, you have to bring more money to the table. Average number of days on market, you don't have to worry too much about the numbers. Just look at kind of the trend. The fall of 2017 versus the spring of 2017. Fall is the dark one. So you can see, it varies, but overall, you're increasing vacancy. Current supply. So remember the chart that Josh had up earlier, you saw this boom in population come up in the mid to late 90s. These are the apartment permits that were pulled 1991 to 2017 that are annualized. Now you can see that you had a real big spike when construction was really fantastic in the mid 90s. Remember how great the construction was? So we were booming, we were pushing it hard, and then it just dropped. And then you see how there's an ebb and a flow, and then you have a really big push here in 2017. A lot of that was, some of these permits are pulled 2 to 3 years prior to development. And some of those permits are being pulled because they wanted to avoid inclusionary zoning before it went in. So we had a really big push of increased permits being pulled on the building side. But they're not really going to start construction until they see how some of these other ones are going to pan out. Are they going to be able to fill the units and then sell the units with the inclusionary zoning piece? Or they're going to run it 2 ways and say, okay, could I be competitive if I had some of the impact of inclusionary zoning on these specific units? All right. I'm going to skim through this really quick. So in 2015, they modified landlord-tenant law. They said you are allowed to charge these fees. You're not allowed to charge these fees. So on the left-hand side, you've got the allowable fees: you can screen charging, late fee, NSF, security deposit, smoke alarm, carbon monoxide tampering fee, non-compliance fee. You had to give a couple warnings, and then you could charge. You can charge a lease break fee of 1.5 months rent flat, or you can charge actual damages, which allows you to bill the tenant for any expense that the landlord incurs in the event that they would not have had the tenant remain. And then homeowners association move-in and move-out fees if it's a direct expense. Okay? Non-allowable fees. So you cannot charge a move-in and move-out fee. You can't charge an administrative fee, no non-refundable pet fees, no cleaning or carpet cleaning fees, and the penalty for charging one of these fees in violation is 2 times the damages. Now, a clarification on the cleaning and carpet cleaning. Essentially, the differentiation is a fee versus a deposit, right? A fee is charged, they're not getting it back regardless of how they treat the property. A deposit is refundable in the event that they return the property in its current or prior condition. The cleaning and carpet cleaning, you can't charge an upfront fee, but if you clean the unit and clean the carpets professionally, then you can bill the tenant on the move out on the way out.
That's just City of Portland, though, right?
Nope. This is Oregon landlord-tenant law.
When did it go into effect?
2015. Well, yes, these are 2015. Okay, caveat real quick. I see a lot of homeowners and a lot of property managers with landlord-tenant violations on their ads. There are so many people that do not know the rules right now and charge these fees, like a pet fee, $200 pet fee for taking on a pet. or they say no Section 8 housing. That doesn't work anymore. So it's crazy the penalties that people are subject to, and they don't know it yet. And we'll get to some of these here as well. Timelines and notice periods. This is what's going to kill you as a broker. No cause terminations. So let me clarify. You'll hear the term no cause eviction. That doesn't exist. An eviction is a legal process by which you go through the legal system, forcibly evict someone for a violation of their lease. A no cause termination is terminating a mutually agreed upon contract. Right? The important differentiation there is the word eviction is used as a scare tactic. A no cause termination, you can give in the state of Oregon 30 days notice to a tenant in the event that they have lived there less than a year. 60 days if they've lived there beyond a year. And in the city of Portland and Milwaukee, it's 90 days minimum, regardless of how long they've lived there. Now, your notice of rent increase. 90-day notice is required for any rent increase in Oregon as of April of 2016. Doesn't apply to utility charges if you're doing utility bill backs. You cannot increase in the first year of the tenancy even if it's month to month. So you can't increase the rent. You go on a month-to-month lease agreement, it's $1,700, you get 6 months into it, you give them a notice, you're not allowed to do that. First year of the tenancy is whatever it was when they moved in. Okay? Here's the kicker. The notice must state the old rent, the new rent, the difference between the two in case they don't have a calculator, and the effective date. And if it doesn't state all of those things, it's an improper notice. And the penalty for an improper notice is 3 months' rent. And an ineffective notice, meaning you have to reissue the notice. So if you hand them a notice that says, hey, your rent is going to $1,800 effective this date, that's an improper notice. So you call them up and say, hey, you didn't pay your full rent. And they say, no, actually, I talked to an attorney, I did pay my full rent, and you owe me 3 months' rent. And you have to start the timeline over again, so why don't you send it to me again? I'll start paying in 90 days when my free rent's up. Do you know the penalty for accessing a property illegally? 1 month's rent. So if you walk in on a tenant naked at their property because you didn't give them notice, you only pay 1 month's rent. If you make a clerical error, it's 3 months' rent.
Who's naked? Me or tenant?
Well, you can be naked or the tenant, whichever. I've never run into either of those situations.
This didn't
Yes.
apply to apartments.
What's that?
This didn't apply to apartments.
He said it doesn't apply to apartments. It absolutely does apply to apartments.
If you have less than, if you only have 1 unit.
This does apply for 1 year. This. I'm sorry.
You're saying it does?
It does apply.
When did that change?
Let's see, 2016. April 14th. No, you're talking about the city ordinance. I'm sorry. Let me be really clear. Oregon landlord tenant law. The only thing that I'm putting up here specific to the ordinance is your 90-day no-cause termination. Everything else is Oregon. We're going to get into some Portland ordinance pieces that are separate, but this is Oregon landlord tenant law. Yeah.
Excuse me,
Yes.
who receives that penalty of 3 months' rent? So the owner has to pay the 3 months' rent, but who do they pay it to?
The tenant.
So the tenant hires an attorney, they say you've given me wrong notice of intent to increase the rent.
Right.
And now you owe me the money.
That's right. See, you follow. Okay, so one of the things that I want to give you, so on the 30 and 60 day, there is a caveat to that. If you have a buyer who intends to occupy the property, you do not have to give the tenant a 60-day notice if you can shrink it to 30. But in Portland, that's not the case. So you understand the difference? So in Portland, regardless of whether or not you're selling the property to an owner-occupant, a 90-day notice of termination is required plus 4 or 5 days mailing. Let's see.
Catch the last part of what you just said, because if, in Portland, if the 60-day notice is not required, if,
Nope. Nope.
owner occupied, buyer agreement accept.
Sorry. In the state of Oregon, 30 days and 60 days are the rules, right? But if you are selling the property to someone who wants to occupy the property, then you can shrink that to 30. But there's no exemption in Portland. Portland is 90 days, 90 days, 90 days regardless. Yeah. Section 8 housing vouchers, we talked about that. You're required to accept them as a form of income. You have to use the multiplier that they're responsible for. So if Section 8 housing voucher is good for $900 and rents $1,000, tenant pays $100, they have to make $300 a month to qualify. Landlord does not have to adjust the housing authority approved rate. So if you go on a housing authority website, they have what they call a rent reasonableness test, which I'm not sure is a word, but they have this spreadsheet. You plug in the amenities and it spits out the number that they'll pay. If you're over that, you accept Section 8 housing vouchers, but your apartment or property does not qualify. Okay? No pet rent or additional security deposit is allowed for companion animals or service animals. Landlords can require insurance. They have it capped at $100,000 essentially, but they cannot require the tenant to be named as additionally insured. Prior to taking any payment from the tenant, the landlord has to disclose all your fees. So your deposit, your fees, your rent, the fact that you require renter's insurance, and your screening criteria. Okay? Many people do not do that. Okay, so we'll get into the Portland City Ordinance here. Now, this is Portland specifically. Milwaukee automatically accepted that as well. They're kind of piggybacking on Portland. So as of February 2nd, 2017, and then it was amended again in July, but I've given the amended timelines here. Tenants are served a notice. Okay, so they have what's called a relocation penalty. Tenants are served a notice of rent, increasing the rent 10% or more within a 12-month period. The landlord has to then, the tenant has 45 days from the notice being served of rent increase to notify the landlord that they're terminating the tenancy, at which time the landlord has 31 days to pay the relocation penalty to the tenant. So think about this, 90-day notice, 45 days, tenant says, hey, I'm moving out, 31 days prior, or 31 days from then, prior to their move out, you hand them a check for 3 months rent. Landlords who serve a no-cause termination to a tenant has to pay the relocation penalty to the tenant 45 days prior to the termination. So, if you want your property back, to sell the property, you give notice to a tenant, 90-day notice. 45 days prior to their move-out, you give them a check for 3 months rent. And they haven't moved out yet. Now, if you didn't serve that notice properly, and you've given them the 3 months rent, it becomes an ineffective notice. Which bears the question, what's the penalty? 3 months rent. And you restart the notice. And you already gave them 3 months rent. Right? Tenant has 6 months from the effective date of increase to either pay it back and remain or provide landlord with termination. 90-day notice is required for all increases and termination notices. Here are some exceptions. Any week-to-week tenancies. Landlord who temporarily rents out their principal residence for a period of 3 years or less. So if you have a client that moves away for 3 years, they can move back to their primary residence and not pay that penalty. Tenants who occupy the same dwelling as the landlord, or a landlord who rents only a single dwelling unit in the city of Portland. All notices are required to be served with the foregoing terms and conditions regarding the tenant's rights, but they don't tell you yet how to serve it, what constitutes proper notice, what actually has to be delivered. They just say you have to give them the rights. So the issue here, as we see it, is that currently they're working, Chloe Daly is working with the city council on trying to withdraw the exemption for the single property. So if your client, or if you have a client that might rent an ADU on the property, they're looking at withdrawing the single unit exemption. Here are the penalties. Studio or single bedroom is going to be $2,900. 1 bedroom is $3,300. 2 bedroom is $4,200. And a 3 bedroom or higher is going to be $4,500. They take this essentially average rental rates for that size unit, and they multiply it by 3, and they say, okay, let's just set the number. That way it's never fluctuating, and it's not a modified amount. Kind of clarify some things. Exceptions and specifics. We're going to skip that one real quick because I bet I don't much of that in another slide. Okay, so House Bill 2004. This was defeated in 2017. Made it through the House. I spent some time down there in the House talking to some House reps and senators as well. And many of you did too. They had a day on the Hill. The realtors went down and spent a little bit of time on this. But it essentially proposed the following. The end to no-cost terminations. That's what we're talking about here, where the tenant hasn't breached their lease agreement. The owner hasn't breached their obligation as a landlord. They just want their property back, to move into it, to soup it up, to have a restart, to get rid of a drug dealer you can't prove, to sell your property. Whatever that situation might be, they want their property back. It's a privately held asset. If you give that no-cost termination now, you might be able to do that. According to House Bill 2004, you would not be able to do that. meaning that the tenant must be offered a similar lease agreement at the tail end of the lease. You go through a 1-year lease agreement, you're at the end, you can't say, hey, look, this isn't working out. Instead, automatically shifts to month to month. If you offer them a lease agreement saying, I don't want month to month because you might move out on Christmas, the tenant does not have to accept your proposal of a lease agreement. You're required to allow them to remain month to month. Requires the term of the lease to become month to month. We talked about that. It still requires a notice of 90-day for increases and terminations, but it requires a relocation penalty to be paid. It removes the statewide ban on rent control, which allows municipalities to determine their own rent and landlord guidelines. So, Portland or Bend or any other metropolitan city could obviously set their own rules as far as how they're going to dictate what the rents are. Here are some exceptions to that. So in the House bill, originally when it was in the House, it had very few exceptions, made it through. Then by the time it got to the Senate, it had some of those things that were removed, at which time the tenant advocate said, hey, we're not on board with this. We wanted it with no exceptions. We want rent control, and that's all we want. And we were able to defeat this by a single vote in the Senate. Can you believe that? All the way through the House to the Senate, and we barely escaped it. But I'm going to tell you the impact that this has. The landlord has accepted an offer, so these are exceptions. If the landlord has accepted an offer from a purchaser who intends the occupied unit. So that means you're going to be selling houses with tenants in place. The landlord intends to undertake repairs to make the unit unlivable or unsafe during construction. The landlord intends to convert the dwelling unit into some other use. Dwelling unit's unsafe for occupancy. Landlord or member of their immediate family intends to occupy the unit as a primary. The tenant receives first right of refusal after renovation, and then they pay 1 month's rent at the time of the notice given. So take this into consideration. If this passed, the no-cause termination goes away, except with this exception. Property needs to be remodeled, and you also have rent control. So assume you have a cap, 5% per year, 10% a year, whatever it is. So the municipality says, here's your rent cap. You say, hey, I've got to soup up this unit. It needs a lot of work. I can't have a tenant there. You pay to relocate the tenant. You give them the money. You give them first right of refusal. You take your $1,200 a month unit that was in shambles. You put $100 grand into it. And now it can rent for $2,100. But you have to do it beyond whatever term that is, because then if you offer back to the tenant, any increase in rent would be an increase of the rent cap. So now you're offering a $2,100 a month unit to someone for $1,200, and it's a brand new souped up unit. The tenant receives first right of refusal, then they pay 1 month's rent. The penalty for illegal notice given is 3 months' rent. Actual damages, look at this. And tenant shall have action for possession by the landlord. So you release it to someone else. They say, hey, this guy, the landlord, gave me an illegal notice. I want the house back. Now you've got a tenant in place you're not allowed to do a no cause on. You have a tenant over here saying, I want the house back. And you have to figure that out and pay the money to do so as the landlord.
Is the relocation fee statewide?
Nope, not yet. It's Portland right now. This House bill included, I'm sorry?
Portland, Milwaukee.
Portland, Milwaukee, yes. Yeah. Yes?
What are what's the definition of a rental dwelling? Is it
I'm sorry?
A rental dwelling? Is an owner-occupied duplex, is the other one
Yes.
one rental dwelling?
Yeah, so the question is, what's a dwelling? A dwelling unit, if you have 2 dwelling units, like a duplex, that's 2 dwelling units, you can rent them. If you live in one and only rent the other one out, you're only renting out 1 unit in the city of Portland. Yeah. Okay, so how does this impact you? Well, landlords, you're going to be required to budget for the relocation, right? So you've got to pay attention to what's it going to cost me to relocate this tenant, how much time will it take me? So that's really important. You're going to have fewer investors that are entering the single-family market. I don't know that they're not going to enter the multifamily market, because investors who like real estate and like the tangible piece of that are still going to continue to invest in real estate. It's just going to be a matter of those single-family dwellings that they're probably not going to be as tied to. And remember, when you're looking at a single-family home, you go from 100% occupied to 100% vacant. And if you go 1 month vacant, that's 1/12 of your annual income on that property. That's a significant difference, and one of the reasons people do 1031 exchanges into larger assets, right?
I'm sorry, can you charge the tenant the relocation fee as a deposit?
No. I like your style, though. The question was, can you charge the tenant the relocation penalty as part of the deposit? The technical answer is yes, you can charge whatever you'd like because there's no cap on deposit, but a deposit is refundable. Yeah, so you can say, you can give me that money up front, but then when they move out, you give them all that money, and then you give them the money out of your money, right? So it comes out of your bank at the same time. So you can't charge a fee equal to the relocation penalty. Clever. More challenges with a downward trend. I mean, we talked a little bit about this. Market's cyclical. They're going to go up and down. If it is a challenge right now for some homeowners that are investing in real estate in an aggressive market where rents are high, what happens in a 2007, 8, 9? When your vacancy is skyrocketing, you're trying to keep that mortgage going so it doesn't get foreclosed on. What happens? Right? You're in a really tight spot. Increasing market liability, which requires more professionals involved. I mean, it's just so complicated at this point. It's almost impossible for someone to manage their own asset, and that's kind of where we are as an industry. Fewer owners, so on the tenant side, I think that it has negative impacts on the tenant as well. Fewer owners willing to give exceptions to existing rules, right? So if I'm a landlord and a tenant says, hey, look, I can't make rent this month, but I can pay you half and I can make another half later. My thinking is, look, man, you've been in there 4 years. I would really like a turnover. I'm not doing anything. Nope. I'm not giving a concession. You don't pay it. I'm giving you a 72, and you're out. And it gives me an opportunity to reset. So it's going to be less opportunity for a tenant to have some flexibility with that landlord. Consistent increase in rents regardless of the tenant care and length of tenancy. There are a lot of landlords that don't increase rents 4 or 5 years. The reason they don't do that, they like the tenant. They care for the property. They communicate well. If you have a rental cap on this, I'm going to increase every year, right? Because I'm capped. I can only go 5, so I'm going 5, right? Because they need to keep in line with that. They're not going to be able to catch up later on. Fewer options for single-family homes with rent because it's going to decrease the supply. Again, 22% to 18% to 10%, and now you have fewer single-family homes. Fewer upgrades, less maintenance on homes, and fewer add-remove situations. We have a lot of roommate situations. Goodness, couldn't think of it. So we have a lot of roommate situations because we got Lewis and Clark, and we got Concordia, and we've got PSU and Portland State. We got all those. University of Portland. So we have all those. We have roommate situations where we can avoid a turnover because you can have an add remove. So 4 tenants move in, 2 move out, 2 new ones move in, 1 moves out, 1 moves in. You got all this flexibility, right? But in a situation like this, that's going to take student housing and completely change it. Because if I'm a landlord, I'm going to say, no, I need to reset. I'm going to reset every single time. A full move in, a full move out. That's what I want every single time. Does that make sense? So I think that impacts a lot of our college folks as well. Yes, ma'am?
So with that tenant change,
Mm-hmm.
you can reset rent?
No, I'm saying if you do an add remove, the tenancy doesn't change. You have a 1-year lease agreement, 2 tenants move out, 2 new tenants move in, the lease agreement remains the same. Right? So right now we allow that to happen as landlords because we're like, hey, you guys are all buddies, you all figure it out, you're a household, cool. But that's not going to happen later on because the longer I let that go, I'm not going to be able to give a termination to a tenant.
Right, but what I'm asking you is, if the tenant changes the roommate situation, does that constitute a change in the tenancy, and can you change the rental agreement and increase the rent?
Well, technically speaking, the way that they do it now is that it does not constitute a modification of the existing lease agreement because you don't have a full move out, full move in. However, you can say you're violating your lease or terminating your lease. I agree, as a landlord, to modify the approach in the lease agreement and then shift it. So you could do that. I can help you a little bit with this afterwards if you'd like. Okay. Yeah. Let's see. Assistance when moving. Okay. Assistance when moving, regardless of the need. That's a positive for the tenant. Every time I move, I'm going to be able to get a few months rent out of it, right? So that there is a positive for the tenant. What's that?
You get paid to move.
Yeah, you get paid to move. I like that. Okay, how does it impact the buyers and sellers? Buyers, you're going to have longer closing timelines. So this is you guys. This is what you're going to need to consider. Longer closing timelines for notice periods to the tenant. Increased time to allow for repairs, bids on the property, appraisals, inspections with the tenant in place. That's going to take more time, more communication. Increased liability if they take on a tenant at closing, right? So if you're representing a buyer takes on a tenant, you take on all the waivers, all the problems, all the issues, the lease agreement, screening, all of that stuff. Diminished turnover condition. As the tenants move out, it's more challenging to enforce. If an owner moves out, you're like, an owner respects their property, they're going to move out, they're going to leave it in good condition. If you're a buyer, you close on a real estate transaction, you took the tenant on at closing because they had to give a 90-day notice. You can't wait that long to close, and it kind of messes up the timelines that you know. And so now you're in a situation where you become a landlord, tenant moves out, then they go back to the seller and saying, look, seller, the tenant trashed the place on the way out. Seller says, you took the tenant. The buyer says, that sucks. Right? So now they're in a situation where they can't really enforce some of those typical rules that are in a standard purchase and sale agreement. Possibility on the buyer side, a possibility of being forced into being a landlord. Many buyers don't want to be landlords, but they got to close on this property, or they need to secure the property because the seller won't give notice to the tenant until they know for sure they're going to take possession. Better opportunity for a lower purchase price. I mean, you can negotiate a little bit, but that means sweat equity, fewer move-in ready properties most likely, and a possible loan breach for the move-in. So let's do the math on this. You go into a 45-day closing period. You do your home inspection, you get your appraisal, you're a month in. Now you got 15 days. If the seller says, okay, I'll give a termination notice to the tenant, that's a 90 plus 5 days. Now, loan requires 95% of owner-occupied properties, you have to occupy the property within 60 days. So if you give a 90-day notice to a tenant to terminate the lease agreement, it spills beyond the 60-day mark. So now the buyer, unless they push close, extend close, which could possibly lead to them losing their rate lock or be in breach of their loan obligation, will be in breach of their loan obligation. The feds aren't going to change their regulation because Portland or the state of Oregon modifies their termination. So you're going to be pushing closing. You're going to have some non-refundable earnest money. You're going to be negotiating a lot of these terms and conditions with the tenant. That's going to be a reality of the business when we get into this. On the seller side, you got a longer closing time frame. We talked about that. It's on both sides. It's going to take longer to sell a house. Inability to complete upgrades and staging, which produce a diminished purchase price. This directly impacts the purchase price of your seller because your seller can't clear the tenant out, replace the floor, repaint, redo the cabinet here. Oh, I recommend staging. Staging is not going to happen on a tenant-occupied property. Increased liability with access for multiple parties within a tenancy. We talked about that. There was a case here where a buyer's agent calls up a tenant, because it was 24-hour notice, calls up the tenant, says, hey, I'm going to be there tomorrow at 2 o'clock. Tenant says, no problem. Hangs up the phone. The next morning, 13-year-old daughter's sick. Calls up the listing agent. Listing agent, somebody called me. They're coming here sometime tomorrow. I wasn't really listening. I was planning on being here all day. I need to cancel that. I got a 13-year-old here. Buyer's agent brought the buyer by, accessed the property, crossed the threshold. That's a penalty of 1 month's rent. Opened up the door to a 13-year-old girl laying in bed. That's an unaccompanied minor. That's a significant problem. Now, who's at fault? The listing agent for not communicating or allowing the buyer's agent to give 24-hour notice? The landlord for not really caring? Right? So we get into some of these issues. You're going to have to come up with a process within your office. How do we deal with the tenant-occupied property? How do we buffer ourselves? Who's in charge of notices? How do we do that? Right? Yes?
Do you see House Bill 204 coming up again or not?
Absolutely. The question is this coming up? Yes. It's coming up. Yes. I firmly believe that. Minimize market, as some buyers will be hesitant or unable to wait. They're just not going to wait. Buyers are going to say, no, I want non-tenant occupied properties. That's all I'm looking at. That's in the search criteria. Is it tenant occupied? Yes or no? Has notice been given? Yes or no? RMLS will have those fields. Lost negotiation position due to the actions of the tenant. I can't tell you how many times I've walked into a property and there's a bomb sitting on the table. That is going, I mean, properties I've listed, not my property. But I'm saying that's going to be a current issue with you. How are you going to get your tenant or train your tenant, or how's the owner going to train their tenant to have that place spotless and ready to go? Showing conditions is going to be tough. Increased costs with relocation expense, because you're going to put that in your closing costs, right? You're going to have to pay the relocation expense. So let's talk about the realtor aspect here. I've got, I think, 5 minutes? Yes. Oh, perfect. Thank you. Okay. So realtor impact. Longer listing periods, longer inspection periods, more communication with the third party, being the tenant, for access and information, and necessary familiarity with those timelines. The documents for a lease agreement, landlord-tenant law. So right now you're licensed to do it. The expectation from the consumer is that you're licensed to do it. You should be able to advise me. Now your clients are going to come to you and say, I want professional advice. How much notice do I have to give to a tenant? Here's the lease agreement that I have. Or if you're representing a buyer, they're going to say, I don't know. Is this a proper lease agreement? I don't know. Has notice been served properly? Because what happens in the event that you give notice, or the seller gives notice to the tenant, you close on the real estate transaction, buyer takes over the tenant at closing, you advise that it was served properly, and then it wasn't. Now you get 60 days into it, buyer comes to you and says, the tenant won't move out. And you say, wait, we closed on this 60 days ago, they're supposed to be out. And they say, I know, but they said it was improper notice, now I owe them 3 months rent because I'm their landlord now. And you're the one that advised me that it was served. We put it in the repair addendum, didn't we? Yes, we did. Well, who confirmed that it was done? Well, I mean, they said they did, right? So that's going to be a process. We're going to have to figure out. Increased liability during all points of access. We talked about that illegal entry thing. Every time you access the property illegally, it's 1 month's rent. There are some tenants that are totally cool and easy to work with. There are others that will wait outside on a 12 to 1 notice. So you give notice for 12 to 1 on Tuesday. You show up at 11:50, that's illegal access. And there will be tenants that will wait out there with a camera and they'll clock it. It's because that's how some tenants are. And that will make it almost impossible for you to have a smooth transaction. But they're good tenants too. Let's see, required systems for showings. Talk a little bit about that. Most probably you're looking at an attorney, whether it be an in-house attorney or an attorney that will review all these docs and say, hey, look, this is the kind of the checklist that I'm looking for, or some type of surveying company or something, another industry may pop up there. Knowledge of recourse if tenants refuse to move out. So you're going to have to know what's the recourse, and you're going to have to advise your buyer on that. More negotiation for possession, possible repairs after closing and vacancy. Larger market. Okay? So let's go through these reasons real quick. Essentially, the reasons are kind of obvious for us, right? There's a shortage of housing. Josh talked a lot about that. Portland's a magical place. I mean, we're close to mountains. We're close to the ocean. There are unicorns here. This is the place where everyone comes. This is the most special place, right? And that's why we're here. That's why everybody wants to be here. And it's those damn California buyers, right? So we have a great opportunity in a great place, and we love it. But that's part of it. In an increasing market, tenants have a hard time finding it because there's not a lot there, and everybody's willing to be here, and everybody's willing to pay the price, and it's market-driven. Moving is expensive for everyone, whether you own a house or whether you rent. And there's a portion of the population who just can't afford to live in Portland. And we get into that cultural situation. Do they deserve to live in Portland? Do they have the right to live in Portland? Should we help fund their right to live in Portland? Right? And sometimes that can be a tricky question. The intention of the ordinance is really to help those in need. But here's the challenge. It penalizes property owners who take on the liability to provide that privately held asset to the tenants that are in place. 22% of single-family homes, 45% of the market, 45% of the dwelling units in Portland are tenant-occupied. That's a crazy number. The assumption is made landlords are rich, tenants are poor. We know that that's not true. How many landlords are here? How many of you would consider yourselves rich? The expense of taxes, insurance, labor fees, those all continue to go up. I mean, if you hire anybody in the trades right now, it's tough. HVAC, plumbers, electricians, those are all hard. Hard to find a good one. Relocation penalty, and this is my beef right here. The relocation penalty is not means-based. I've got tenants living in Laurelhurst who make $260,000 a year. $4,500 is what they get on the way out. Regardless, because they're a tenant. Tenants are treated as a class. Not people who are in need or not in need. And I think that that's a significant dynamic shift, something we as realtors should be focused on. The benefits given to tenants as a class regardless. Meanwhile, you have 50% of the people who qualify for Section 8 housing vouchers that are on an 8 to 10 year waiting list not being served. We can fix it. That's the good news. But it has to be logical and practical. So here's our alternative solutions. I'm working with a couple groups right now to bring this before the city, bring this before the state if possible. If affordable housing really is a core value of Portland, it's my belief that all of us should contribute. Owners who are not renting and aren't landlords should contribute because it endorses the neighborhood, endorses lifestyle in Portland, and is a core value. In my opinion, that's kind of the direction that we should be going. The subsidies should be distributed to people that are in need, as opposed to just those because they're a tenant. I think that any subsidy or benefit should go to those individuals. And our communities can use the federal guidelines. We have HUD guidelines that are set up currently in place. We have an opportunity as a community to say, let's piggyback on that, not reinvent the wheel. You have a waiting list. Let's serve those that are on your waiting list. Instead of just any tenant because they're a tenant, and penalize the landlord who's trying to provide that housing. And then, one idea that I had, this is not an end-all be-all, but one idea is everybody pays an annual fee, one fee, right? No one likes fees, no one likes bond measures unless they benefit directly from it. I'll vote for the school one because they got kids in school, or I vote for the art tax because I love art. But this is a situation where we have an opportunity where there is a housing crisis, there is a homelessness issue, and we can resolve that, but it has to be a practical way to go about that. So one of the ideas that I had here was, I'm not claiming this is my idea necessarily, but something that I'm loving, is an opportunity for us to all contribute a little bit, and then put that forward, and then as we do that, we can then distribute those together to people that are in need as opposed to just a blanket. So in general, what I want you to take away from today is that there's a lot of stuff going on. It directly impacts you and your career and the housing situation. I'm not really a soapbox guy for the most part, but I see a major hole in some directions that we're going. I encourage you to talk to your legislator and your city council folks. I encourage you to talk to PMAR. I encourage you to talk to any realtor association you're involved in and really look at how this is going to impact you and your clients. And if you have clients that are also impacted by this, I recommend that you talk to them as well.